What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. We'll be going over 5 wide receivers to trade for in today's video, looking not only at volume, but also recent performances and what we should expect from these players moving forward. We're only doing 5 receivers though, so if you want a complete list, you can check that out at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But let's get things started off today with the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was through the first 5 weeks, 18 running backs had at least 20 targets. Who was the only one with fewer than 15 receptions? And the answer is Miles Sanders. Soiled sponge was the first to get that one right. Today's stat, through 5 weeks, the top 3 tight ends in air yards is Mark Andrews, Travis Kelce, Mike Gesicki, and who is 4th? All right, first receiver we'll go over today is Terry McLaurin. Now, McLaurin ranks 12th in air yards, 8th in targets, but is only 23rd in fantasy points per game and is coming off a 3-reception, 36-yard, 0-touchdown dud, while also having a lot of uncertainty at the quarterback position. The thing is, he's so clearly the top wide receiver in Washington, and he's still getting the volume. I'd be much more concerned if he was on this dreadful offense with all this ambiguity at quarterback and he wasn't really being used. But don't forget that he just posted 10 for 118 on Baltimore 2 weeks after dropping 7 for 125 and a touchdown in Arizona. In fact, he might be 23rd in points per game, but he's on pace for 93 receptions and over 1,300 yards this season. The only reason he's not a top 10 fantasy wide receiver right now is the touchdowns. He's only on pace to finish with 3 on the season, and that's going to make it really difficult to finish as a high-end fantasy producer without the touchdowns. But remember what we talked about with Gibson yesterday. Washington has a dream schedule over the next 2 months. Dallas twice, the Giants twice, then the Lions and the Bengals. Exactly 0 of those defenses are capable of slowing down or stopping Terry McLaurin. And while Alex Smith looked pretty dreadful on Sunday, the Rams are a really good defense. And it was his first game back, first game even being active since suffering that horrible injury. And so we got to cut him a little bit of slack. I don't think he was expecting to be put into that game, and he probably would have preferred a little bit more time to get back and get ready. But Kyle Allen is probably going to be the starter in week 6. Remember we talked about last week how Haskins to Allen, pretty much a lateral move. I don't think either of them is very good. I don't think either of them is much better than the other. We can almost throw Alex Smith in there, although I'll say the upside with Alex Smith is a little bit higher than Kyle Allen. So if we think potential for Terry McLaurin down the stretch, maybe Kyle Allen's the quarterback for the next few weeks, and then they shift to Alex Smith. There's a little bit of potential there with Alex Smith being better because he has been a solid quarterback in his career. He's not exceptional. He's not going to elevate this team into a playoff contender or anything, but he could be better than Kyle Allen. But I think the bigger point is that they're all fairly similar, and they're all going to lean on Terry McLaurin. And given their schedule and that he'll likely have a few pretty big games over the next 2 months, I really think after this dud and only having 1 touchdown in the season, right now is probably the best time to trade for him, because if he has another explosion, there's no way his people are going to look, the people who own him are going to look and see 7 for 125 and a touchdown, 10 for 118. Let's say he posts another 100 and a touchdown game soon. They're not going to trade him after that. So I think right now, given the schedule has been a little bit more difficult, going to get easier, I think now is the time to trade for him. Justin Jefferson is the next wide receiver we'll go over today, and it's not because he's just some incredible value based off of the volume. He's pretty much performing as we should expect, but I think that's the point with Jefferson. His owners will think that the production was a fluke. You know, having these spiked weeks, they're going to be like, oh, that was just a little bit of randomness. He's a rookie. That's going to happen, but he's not going to be consistent at all. But Jefferson is legit, and he was up to 80% of the snaps last week and has 24% of the Vikings' air yards, but he only ranks 57th in targets. But that's only low because really of weeks 1 and 2. He's playing a lot more now, and the targets have gone up because the snaps have gone up. Starting in week 3, he has 9, 5, and 5 targets in each week, which is roughly what we should expect moving forward. Like I said, he's not some amazing value when you're looking at his points per game, comparing it to the volume he's receiving. But that's mostly because of one blow-up game. The sentiment around him is not going to be as high as the points per game suggests it would be. He has 3 games with 3 or fewer receptions, 45 or fewer receiving yards, plus everyone knows that Thielen is the top wide receiver on this offense. But Jefferson has already started his breakout, which typically for a rookie wide receiver starts more at the midway point of the season. And once he does break out, you're not going to be able to trade anything to get him. He's coming off kind of like Terry McLaurin. He's coming off a 3 for 23 performance. And I guarantee his owners think that they're selling high on him after having those 2 big weeks, but seeing a few of these duds. They're like, oh, I got to get rid of him now because if he has another dud, his value is going to go way down. But I think this is very similar to what we saw with A.J. Brown last year. Brown had 2 big games over his first 4 weeks and then fizzled out a little bit before just exploding in weeks 12 through 17. But with Brown, people saw that low volume offense and they figured that the spiked weeks to start the season were nothing more than that. They were just random stretches of positive variance. Ultimately, they weren't, and he turned into a league winner over the final 2 months. The only difference here is that Jefferson's explosion is very likely going to come quicker than A.J. Brown's because of the snaps. Brown didn't get over 70% of the snaps last season until week 10, whereas Jefferson became the starting wide receiver in week 3. And like I said, he's already up to 80% of the snaps. And realistically, let's say I'm wrong. Well, what's the worst that can happen? Basically that you're trading for the second wide receiver on Minnesota, which is still a relatively valuable role. It's not like you're going to trade for him and all of a sudden he's going to go down to like 2 and 3 targets a week. He's a talented receiver and is clearly the second receiving threat in this offense. It's not like he's getting passed on the depth chart at this point. So worst case scenario is that it takes a little bit longer for him to break out and he maxes out as like a flex play this season. But he's not going to cost you much more than that to acquire him. And so there really doesn't feel like there's any risk here. And I can assure you 1 more spiked week and you're not going to get it. 2 spiked weeks can be randomness. 3 blow-up games over the first 2 months and his price is going way up. And if you look at his upcoming schedule, it's not going to be very surprising if that happens. Falcons, Packers, Lions over the next 3 weeks. I really think one of those games he's going off and then you won't be able to get him. Next up, we have Marquise Brown. This one will probably be a little surprising since we did have him as a buy low in recent weeks, and he has been performing pretty well 2 weeks in a row. Week 4 goes 4 for 86 on 8 targets, and then this last week, 6 receptions for 77 yards and a touchdown on 10 targets. The thing is, even with these 2 games, he's still being undervalued. Hollywood now ranks 4th in air yards, 18th in targets, but just 42nd in fantasy points per game. The biggest reason is that he hasn't had a spiked week yet. But we all know that that's coming, right? Lamar has been a little bit quiet this season, and the Ravens actually rank 8th in points per game right now after ranking 1st by 2 whole points last season. But Lamar is going to have one of his just massive games soon, and given that the receiving volume is almost exclusively running through Hollywood and Mark Andrews right now, I mean, one of them, whenever Lamar goes off, one of them is going to have a huge game. And you don't just maintain the 4th most air yards in the league and rank 42nd in fantasy points per game, unless, of course, you're A.J. Green. But Marquise Brown is not that bad. But speaking of A.J. Green, I'm listing T. Higgins as a trade target again this week. We talked about him, I believe, 2 weeks ago, basically saying that at this point, A.J. Green is dust, and that Higgins is really the one that you want. And I think the point has been proven true in every week since that. Higgins is now the clear top receiver on the Bengals, but he's still been underperforming his volume. He ranks 14th in air yards, 37th in targets, but just 52nd in fantasy points per game. The thing is, you can start Higgins in the flex moving forward. John Ross has been a healthy scratch. We see Higgins playing a season high 81% of the snaps this last week, and that resulted in another 8 targets, bringing his average up to 7.5 per game as the starter. 7.5 targets is really nice volume, especially when he ranks right behind Tyreek Hill for 12th in air yards per target. So it's not like he's getting the looks, but they're all really close to the line of scrimmage. They're getting him the ball downfield, and he's got a lot of weekly upside because of that. Just look at his route tree versus Baltimore. These routes aren't moving horizontally across the field like a lot of low upside players will see. The majority of his routes are working their way downfield, which leads to a much higher weekly ceiling. And I like trading for him because he hasn't really hit that ceiling yet. Sure, he had that multi-touchdown game in week 3, but it came on 5 receptions for 40 yards. And aside from that one game, I mean, he's been over 65 receiving yards once. He has a high of only 5 receptions thanks to a really low 53% catch rate. But that's been what's keeping his price in the market so low. And given his volume, we should expect a 100-yard game soon, especially with Green likely to miss some time with yet another injury. I talked about this before, but Higgins doesn't really get that same level of hype as these other rookie receivers are getting, and that's mostly due to where he was taken. You know, he doesn't have that first-round draft capital because he was taken with the first pick in the second round. But this kid is good, and he's got incredible upside over the second half of the season. So I really think it's a good idea to get him now before he just starts to explode, because he is now the number 1 receiver on an offense that is underperforming this season, but has looked better as of late and is very likely just going to improve every single week until we get towards the fantasy playoffs. And that's probably where they're going to peak. And that's where you're maybe going to be starting T. Higgins as your wide receiver too, and it's not going to cost you that right now. So I think now is the time to get him. The final receiver we'll go over today is Michael Gallup, and Gallup has been pretty frustrating to own so far this season, and after the Dak injury, I'm sure people are just going to be done with Gallup. But I actually think there are reasons to be optimistic about him. Gallup hauled in 3 receptions for 65 yards on 3 targets over the final 8 minutes last week. And it's worth noting that Dalton trusted Gallup when they needed the yards, and then he delivered with 2 just incredible catches. And also, Gallup has already been getting a little bit unlucky. He ranks 11th in air yards, but 41st in fantasy points per game, mostly because Dak has been favoring Amari, Lamb, and the running backs over Gallup. But Dalton is more than capable of running this offense. He will not be what Dak was, but he can operate this offense. He can sustain fantasy relevant players, and we can't know yet who he's going to favor. Now, Amari is still the best wide receiver on this roster, and we should expect him to continue leading the team in targets. But sometimes quarterbacks just prefer different receivers. And it's absolutely possible that Dalton leans on Gallup, especially after what he just did with him late in the 4th quarter last week. Remember, 3 receptions for 65 yards in the final 8 minutes of the game, all, of course, with Dalton. So given that his price will absolutely be lower after the injury and after starting the season so slow, I think it would be smart to send a trade offer for him. And I'd expect you're sending roughly flex value, maybe just 2 kind of low-end bench pieces might be able to get the job done. And I don't see why you wouldn't at least try that, because maybe Dalton comes in, maybe he prefers Gallup, and Gallup produces like we thought he would to to start the season, especially since Dallas's defense isn't getting any better. And so given that they're probably going to be a little bit worse on offense, they're going to fall behind quickly and they're going to have to throw the ball, and that's going to benefit Gallup. So those are 5 receivers that I would be trading for this week. If you want a complete list of all wide receivers to target, as well as some running backs, then you can check that out at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. That's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, then how about hitting that like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? Thanks for watching.